All right. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Sarah Keys. I'm the CEO of an ESG advisory firm called ESG Global Advisors. And today I'm going to be talking to you for the next 25 minutes or so on where business risk meets climate risk. So, what you need to know about the new climate disclosure rules and how they may impact your organization. I welcome questions throughout. There is a microphone right at the back if you do have any questions or comments to make. And I will move around the stage just because that's where I'm most comfortable. But I do have a short presentation for you and then happy to leave some time for questions at the end. I'm going to keep my voice up because I know we got a trade show that's busy with folks networking behind us, and I want to make sure everyone can hear. Does it sound okay for everyone? Minus that? Okay, good. So big picture, first thing I'd like to do is talk about the whole focus in the capital markets driving the need for climate disclosure. And so we know, obviously, being here at the EV Charging Expo 2024 in Toronto, that we have a huge problem in front of us in terms of climate change and the net zero transition, a lot of which is going to rely on electrification to make this happen. So a lot of risk, but tons of upside opportunity. And that's why the private sector is interested as well. So, the private sector has been doing corporate social responsibility for quite some time. CSR, most of us would be familiar with that term. And it's all about, doing positive things for the community and the environment. It's about corporate philanthropy and volunteering. It's been around since the 80s. So why is everyone saying that this whole movement toward ESG is new? I would argue it's more of an evolution than a revolution, meaning it's born out of the ideas of CSR, but ultimately over the past several decades since CSR was popularized in the private sector, we haven't really addressed some of these big global issues, most notably climate change and the need to decarbonize to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2050. And so the private sector is now realizing that, in fact, because so many of these issues have been left unchecked and are seen as externalities in financial decision-making and capital allocation, that actually these environmental and social issues are now actually coming back to rear their ugly head and actually erode or create real business risks that could impact corporate value creation, meaning over the long term, things like the inability to transition to a lower carbon economy could mean that a company might default on paying back its debt or may not be as high of an investment return as originally imagined. So ESG is the other side of CSR. It's the impact of environmental and social issues on the company. And today I'm going to focus in on the topic of climate change, which of course is the big ESG issue of the day. Now, I want to acknowledge that both are important, and that's where true sustainability comes in, right? Companies thinking about their impacts on environmental and social issues, but also in the 21st century, thinking about the risks that those environmental and social issues are also creating for their ability to generate value. So sustainability considers both and is more of an umbrella term. And why this is important? Well, the World Economic Forum is recognizing through their Global Risks Report, which they issue every single year, that the types of risks facing governments and companies, as well as those who provide them capital, the big investors like banks and pensions, are all facing different dimensions of risk in 2024 than we were back in the late 90s. In particular, a number of risks are actually related to environmental, social, technological, and geopolitical issues. This report seeks to rank these global risks in terms of their impact to companies. And what it's showing here is that of the top 10, only 2 of them are actually economic by nature, meaning our traditional way of measuring financial performance isn't really capturing the risk environment that companies are operating in. And importantly, of course, for this conference, as we look to the longer term, these risks become largely environmental in nature, meaning if we don't address climate change, which is one of the top risks and interconnected with all of the other risks in a 10-year time horizon related to environment and social, then we really aren't going to be able to achieve true sustainability, meeting the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs as well. But in the private sector, this is really all about dollars and cents rather than saving the world, meaning companies see a profit imperative to doing decarbonization work and to thinking about climate risk and opportunity. And the first is because in order to get money, public and private sector companies now need to be able to illustrate that they've thought about their environmental and social risks and opportunities, most notably climate change, which has been the focus of a number of investors around the world, including our big pension plans, one of which we're all beneficiaries of, the Canadian Pension Plan, which actually thinks about the climate risk in their investments and asks companies to set targets and reduce their emissions to prepare for that lower carbon future we all hope for. Increasingly, companies are also seeing an opportunity with their customers to increase their market share. As companies pay attention to their brand and reputation and their company's contribution to climate change, it's helpful to attract the younger generations of customers who tend to vote with their dollars in terms of which brands they choose to buy from and also which companies they choose to work for. And that's all about employee attraction and retention. Millennials and Gen Zs are now the largest generations in the workforce, and they want to work for organizations that align with their values. So increasingly important to be able to talk about how the organization is addressing big issues like climate change and greenhouse gas emissions to attract and retain the top talent. And last but not least, we've seen the physical risks across Canada, and we have a pretty emissions-intensive economy consisting of oil and gas, transportation, real estate, agriculture, and other heavy industry. So we have a lot at stake economically, which is why expos like this, where people can meet, collaborate, and tackle these complex systemic challenges like net zero by 2050 are so important and urgent. And that's why we see this global focus from investors on net zero. Ultimately, they recognize that 2050 goal is not so far away. In fact, perhaps someone graduating from school today and getting their first pension as a teacher will be retiring around that 2050 mark, which means that pensions like Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan have been thinking about climate risks in their investment portfolio for quite some time, because it's part of their responsibility to make sure there's money to pay out to those beneficiaries upon retirement. And it's that long-term investment horizon that forces them to think about climate change today. And interestingly, all the investors know they can't do it alone. And while it's very powerful because they hand out money to companies in the real economy, they've found that the power of collaboration is far more meaningful. Meaning, we've seen investors working together on global scales in an unprecedented way since the Paris Agreement was struck in 2015. And importantly, those investors have made it really clear that they're looking for a few things from companies. The first is better reporting and disclosure, and that's what all the new regulations are focused on, satisfying the investor demand for this information so they can make better decisions on companies' climate risks. The second is really around measuring their greenhouse gas emissions. Still, a number of public and private companies across Canada have not yet taken their initial baseline measurement. In order to get to net zero, we need to be able to measure where we are today. And the third is then to set targets on that. Investors are asking the companies they're investing in to set those targets to help them achieve their portfolio decarbonization goals as a whole, all with a view to managing financial risk. And so when we talk about the focus areas in the emissions world, and we're going to talk a little bit about the new reporting and disclosure regulation, I want to define some key terms that are probably well known to most of you if you're attending this expo. And that is the scopes of emissions. So what you see on a global scale in terms of the new disclosure regulation is that they're pretty much focused on one metric, along with others that companies use, but there is one universal metric, and that's greenhouse gas emissions. And we do have global protocols, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, to be able to reliably and consistently measure that. So Scope 1 emissions are those direct from the operation of your manufacturing facilities. They're the emissions that occur in those operations that are owned or controlled by the company, meaning you have the most ability to reduce those emissions, Scope 1. Scope 2 are your indirect emissions, and this is all about the emissions associated with the purchase and use of electricity consumed by the company in its operations. As many of us know, if you're grid connected, the jurisdiction where you're located is going to drive those Scope 2 emissions pretty significantly. One manufacturing plant in Ontario might have a significantly lower Scope 2 emissions footprint than that same manufacturing plant if it were located in Saskatchewan, where there's more fossil fuel intensive electricity on the grid. So Scope 2 is indirect, less in their control, but you do have some control as to where you site your facilities. And Scope 3 is important. The most contentious of the emissions, it's the upstream and downstream supply chain emissions, meaning completely outside of the company's control, but it is a result of the company's existence, its operations, products, and activities. And increasingly, companies are being asked to measure and set targets to reduce those Scope 3 emissions. Why is that going to be challenging? Well, they are not owned or controlled by the company. And so in the United States, we've seen a lot of pushback against getting companies to measure and report on Scope 3 emissions, whereas the global standards do include Scope 3, and I'll provide an overview of those standards in a moment. So obviously we find ourselves today at the EV and Charging Expo in Toronto, and this is a huge collaboration when we think about the uptake needed and electrification of everything to achieve our net zero target as a country, right? And so the demand for electricity is expected obviously to skyrocket as we seek to move passenger vehicles as well as freight and long haul transportation away from fossil fuel intensive internal combustion engines and toward more fully electric and hybrid vehicles. Obviously, this is good news for the utilities who will see a huge increase in demand for electricity through this process, but it also comes with an incredible amount of investment required to build that generation capacity to fulfill the future demand, which remains uncertain and hinges on the uptake, of course, of electric vehicles. But it also is linked to the physical impacts of climate change and the ability to move electricity through poles and wires. Our utilities are no strangers to the impacts of physical risks of climate change, dating back, a good example being the ice storm in Toronto in 2015, which knocked out power over the Christmas holidays week, and we had to actually bring in utility workers from neighboring provinces at paying time and a half overtime to help get us out of that situation so people could have power restored in the depths of winter. So plenty of examples where utilities and infrastructure are going to be the backbone of this. But we also see all of the supply chain and ecosystem around auto dealers and manufacturers, many of whom are now building large-scale plants to invest in the development of batteries. We've seen Honda invest in Ontario just this past week. We also know that fleet operators have to think about this, particularly because those big customers tend to be big publicly traded companies who are now being asked to report on their supply chain emissions, which means the fleet operators who provide fleet management services to those larger companies are going to get asked to report their emissions and increasingly to reduce them. And we're seeing a growing imperative from the customer. So it all started out as a focus on how much is debt or how much is equity going to cost us? Who will invest in us? And now it's also evolving to say it's not just a balance sheet issue, it's also an income statement. Our customers are asking us. And the trickle-down effect of that is significant. It has revenue implications. And a number of large companies are saying in their new RFPs that in order to do business with them, you have to be willing to report on your emissions and set targets to reduce them because that helps them achieve their goals for Scope 3. So I'm going to talk briefly now about the reporting frameworks. And what I want to highlight is it's not just an issue if you're a publicly traded company. It is also going to be an issue for privately held companies that are seeking debt or that have major customers that are big publicly traded companies. So this is no longer just an issue if you are subject to securities law here in Canada. It's actually something that everyone should be paying close attention to. And so I mentioned earlier in the very first slide, we had CSR, ESG, and true sustainability encompassing both. What I want to highlight here is the new regulations are very much focused on ESG, meaning the financially material risks to the company. That's what's relatively new. Many organizations who've been doing CSR for a number of years have reports focused on communicating on their impacts to society and environment. But what's relatively new is kind of the flipping of the script like ESG does, which is asking now the finance function, the CFO, the board of directors, to certify that this information is correct and to include it in their financial reporting, which puts a whole new level of rigor around the requirements to sign off on that information for consistency, completeness, comparability, and even auditability. And so these two standards are the newer standards that are forming the backbone of the global accounting standards for sustainability based on financial materiality. So we have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board standards, the SASB standards for short, and we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The SASB standards were established in 2011 in the United States. They take an industry-by-industry approach to assessing the bare minimum material, environmental, and social topics for a company operating in that sector, and it provides the associated accounting metrics. It covers all ES&G issues, including but not limited to climate change. In contrast, we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is focused solely on the issue of climate change and takes an industry-agnostic approach. 11 disclosure recommendations that span the topics of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So how do these two frameworks fit together? The reason they've become in tandem used to develop the international standards is because these are the frameworks that investors have been asking companies to voluntarily adopt since their inception. The SASB standards came out in 2011, the TCFD recommendations in 2017. And so the two can actually be used to provide qualitative and quantitative disclosure to investors and other providers of capital. So the TCFD follows this four-pillar model as shown in the concentric circles, and it has 11 disclosure recommendations underpinning each. The governance side asks for the management's role and board oversight of climate. Strategy asks consideration of short, medium, and long-term impacts to your business model and your strategy overall, as well as scenario planning for different climate futures. Risk management asks about integration into your enterprise risk management framework. And metrics and targets asks you to disclose greenhouse gas emissions as well as any other metric the company uses to manage its most important climate risks and opportunities. And so the SASB standards come in on the metrics piece. They provide additional metrics that can be used to shed light on the effectiveness of some of the more qualitative process-oriented disclosures included in the strategy, risk, and governance categories. And so I've mentioned several times that the international sustainability standards are underway. And the International Sustainability Standards Board was a really critical development, first established in December 2021. The IFRS Foundation established the ISSB. And the IFRS Foundation set the global accounting standards for many countries around the world, including here in Canada. So when the IFRS Foundation says they're creating a new board focused on sustainability standards, the Canadian capital markets pay close attention. And we'll talk about in a moment what they are doing in response. And the whole idea was to deal with this alphabet soup of reporting regulations that existed without any mandatory reporting requirements for companies. There are so many voluntary frameworks, over 150 have popped up over the last decade or so, that are being used by companies to try and give their investors and other providers of capital the information that they're looking for. And so the goal was to harmonize, not to recreate the wheel and add a new set of standards and just further complicate the landscape. It was to take the best and most well-supported frameworks from the voluntary market and actually use those as the foundation for the new global standards. And that is what was done with IFRS S1 and S2. S1 is general requirements for sustainability, and S2 is specifically focused on climate. S2 includes Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. It includes climate change scenario analysis. It is robust and almost identical to the TCFD, along with additional requirements. So what I want to highlight here is a couple of things. The whole goal was to encourage a global baseline. So the idea is that countries around the world would then take these standards and adopt them as much at face value as possible so we don't have too many deviations where it no longer is comparable, thus defeating the purpose of the exercise. So interoperability was one of their key objectives. A company in Canada shouldn't be penalized from a reporting burden perspective for being in Canada relative to that same company operating in another jurisdiction, because that would cause competitiveness concerns. So the whole purpose is really to create that global baseline and then allow the jurisdictions to adopt it. So what is Canada doing? So the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board was struck just under a year ago, and they have now taken those final two standards that came from the ISSB on the global scale. They have made few timing modifications, but no content modifications to the standards, and they are now out for public consultation. And so the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board has a remit to support the adoption of those ISSB standards in Canada. And as the ISSB continues its work and starts to cover other topics, most notably on its 2024 work plan are biodiversity and nature and human capital management. So we're starting to get into some social issues as well. As those standards are developed, the CSSB is also going to be influencing up to ensure that the Canadian perspective is captured. So while we're starting with climate, it's only the beginning of the topic-specific standards, and we're going to expect to see standards on human capital and biodiversity and nature as the next two standards coming from the ISSB. So in Canada, they are evaluating adopting these new standards on a voluntary basis for reporting periods ended on or after January 1st, 2025, with some relief provisions, particularly around those challenging Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions to measure. And why is this important? Well, the next step is going to be for the securities regulators to adopt it. They're still going to be voluntary until the Canadian Securities Administrators incorporates in whole or in part reference to these standards in their final climate disclosure rule, which is ultimately expected either at the end of this year or early next year. So any publicly traded companies, TSXV or TSX, should definitely be watching to participate in those consultations and ensure you've had your voice heard. On a more global scale, those who have significant operations in California or Europe need to pay attention because different jurisdictions are moving at different paces. Europe being the most stringent of the jurisdictions with their corporate sustainability reporting directive. And you might think, oh, I don't have to deal with that. I'm here in Canada. Well, over 50,000 companies are captured in this new directive, requiring reporting on sustainability. And 10,000 of those companies are domiciled outside of Europe. So it can be based on having a significant customer or significant operations in Europe. And about 1,300 of those companies are expected to be in Canada. So many Canadian organizations are getting caught with the more stringent European regulation. The other thing to keep in mind is our neighbors to the south. We've seen the United States securities regulator, the SEC, publish their final rule in March without Scope 3 and then put it on pause in April due to litigation from business interest groups. So certainly been a very contentious, politicized rule in the United States. However, in California, which captures over 40% of the US economy, we've actually seen them move ahead with an extremely stringent regulation capturing both public and private companies and requiring reporting of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So you can see the divergence of views from different regulators around the world, and important to keep in mind if you have significant customers or suppliers in those jurisdictions. And so the last thing I want to leave you with, and then I've left 5 minutes for questions, is where to get started. Look, this is a journey of progress, not perfection, particularly if you are trying to raise capital in the public markets, debt or equity, or if you're really trying to satisfy growing customer demands for this information. It is something that takes time to gather. There's a lot of capacity building and work that goes into doing an initial carbon footprint for an organization and then ultimately documenting and reporting that. But it is important to get started. And the first thing I would advise is to not try to be all things to all people. Focus in on the most significant, high impact, high likelihood climate change risks and opportunities to your business. Narrow it down and prioritize. That's a materiality assessment. Focus on what matters so that you get the highest bang for your buck in your strategy. And then figure out where you want to be on those issues. It's important to ask yourself realistically the level of ambition that you're willing to commit to as an organization and the follow through in providing resources to achieve that, which is really what step 3 is all about, operationalizing it. Step 4, make sure that you're able to actually gather that information and engage your finance function where it makes sense to do so to help you do this, and develop that reporting roadmap, a plan for the organization to start to align to some of these emerging best practice frameworks. And of course, step 5, you're going to want to continuously improve your strategy. Keep monitoring that performance, adjusting where things are working, and sharing lessons learned from pilot programs. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up, say thank you to all of you for your time and attention, and happy to answer any questions if anyone has them.